Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very exciting event with Rashid Khalidi, who is Edward Saeed Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. Professor Khalidi will be speaking on his book this evening titled The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, published by Metropolitan Books recently. My name is Heidi Matthews. I'm an assistant professor of law at Osgoode Hall Law School. And this event is being hosted by the Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime, and Security at Osgoode, which of course is at York University in Toronto. We're co-organizing the event with Hearing Palestine at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. The Nathanson Center works to facilitate a cross-disciplinary program of research and project initiatives that enhance knowledge of issues related to a variety of transnational phenomena that are rapidly changing and, of course, challenging society, law, and governance. The Center and Osgoode are delighted to be hosting this event today and incredibly grateful to the many folks, including graduate students, who have worked hard to make it happen. Before I turn the floor over to Mariana Rice and Lena Lashin, I just want to note to everyone again that the event is being recorded. So with that, thanks so much for joining, and over to you, Mariana and Lena.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for the wonderful introduction. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lena Lashin. I am a graduating student at the Munk School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and I'm one of the students working with Hearing Palestine this year. Before we begin, I would just like to do a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that our campus, though this is virtual and many of us may be operating somewhere else, our St. George campus is located on the lands that the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River have called their home for thousands of years before Europeans have expropriated their territories in the 19th century. Southern Ontario is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We recognize the dispossession of First Nations and acknowledge that we who are non-Indigenous beneficiaries of historical and contemporary forms of colonialism in Canada are therefore standing in unequivocal solidarity with those who seek to dismantle the system and make this country a place of equal opportunity for all. I will now pass things over to my co-host, Mariana.
Thanks, Lena. So my name is Mariana. I'm a 7th year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. And I've been involved in research on and organizing around Palestine for roughly a decade now. So I'm really excited to be a part of this today. And I'm going to tell you all a little bit about Hearing Palestine, which is a new initiative at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. And it's supported by various departments across the university, including history, anthropology, NMC, religion, and CSIS. Hearing Palestine provides an intellectual space for Palestinians and those interested in the history and future of Palestine to share their experience and research. The initiative is designed to improve the university experience for students enduring and concerned about anti-Palestinian discrimination on campus. Hearing Palestine encourages dialogues on cultural life, artistic creativity, social justice, and current affairs in Canada and the Middle East from the perspective of Palestine. The initiative is in solidarity with Indigenous struggles everywhere and encourages critical engagement with settler colonialism, sectarianism, and authoritarianism in the Middle East, Canada, and elsewhere. And Hearing Palestine has recently launched its website, which you'll be able to see here, palestinestudies.artsci.utoronto.ca. And so I encourage everybody to check it out for more information about the project, who's involved, upcoming events, and other things related to the Hearing Palestine project. So I'm going to pass it on to Anver to talk a little bit about the Institute for Islamic Studies. So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. It's as director of the Institute of Islamic Studies, it's an honor to host Rashid Khalidi. this inaugural event for the year. And so I want to thank him for joining us. The Institute is a research-oriented space designed to collaborate with colleagues to develop new and exciting and innovative research-oriented projects. And so I'm not going to belabor what we do, but I want to give a special note of thanks to Jens Hansen and Alejandro Paz, who have been our amazing leads on this project, as well as the members of the steering committee who are here as well and who helped lead this initiative. So I'll pass it on. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's me now. I'm Alejandro Paz. I'm Professor of Anthropology, Associate Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Toronto. And I would just like to say a few words, first about the center, but mostly of gratitude to the people who worked, the faculty who worked promoting the center and ensuring that we got a victory last week. So we are very grateful to the Nathanson Center for hosting this event and co-organizing with us at Hearing Palestine. Perhaps many of you know why the University of Toronto was placed under censure. Last year, after an offer was rescinded to Dr. Valentina Azarova for what the Canadian Association of University Teachers, CAUT, found to be politically motivated donor interference. The politics of the interference had to do with Dr. Azarova's human rights work on the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Now, the censure has been temporarily lifted by CAUT, but there are still ongoing issues around donor protocols and academic freedom for professional managers, for example, the person who would direct the International Human Rights Program at the Faculty of Law. So I think it's fitting to speak after our incredible colleague, Professor Anver Iman, who has been a force this last year in responding to the outrageous interference in collegial governments and academic appointments that occurred at the Faculty of Law in 2020. We'd like to acknowledge, we here at Hearing Palestine would like to acknowledge the incredible work of Censure U of T, of which Anver was a part, and its massive victory this last week. You are a very dedicated team of faculty and students who in essence fought a public relations battle against, to use Professor Khalidi's phrase, the war on Palestine, the denial of space, land, and recognition to Palestinians as legitimate subjects and agents of their own history. And you won. Dr. Azarova did receive an offer, a good faith offer. There are organizations who are currently waging this war on Palestine and seek to intimidate campus communities, lest we speak openly about Palestine and collectively change the dominant narrative which maintains public support for the state of Israel. You push back to secure academic freedom and to overcome the Palestine exception. You made space for Hearing Palestine to exist and for us to continue our work. We at Hearing Palestine are extremely grateful for all you have done. And I'm now pleased to turn it over to Professor Jens Hansen, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, this is me, Jens Hansen. I teach Middle East and North African history here at U of T. And it's a super huge pleasure and honor to welcome to you all the Edward Saeed Professor of Arab Studies and a longtime chair of the History Department at Columbia University, Professor Rashid Khalidi. Both Palestine and the University of Toronto have been through a lot this summer. Our Hearing Palestine initiative is a small contribution to help dismantle colonial structures of power and make both the University of Toronto and Palestine more equitable places. And I could not think of a more brilliant and seasoned historian of Palestine to launch this, the second semester of our activities towards institutionalizing the study of Palestine at the University of Toronto than Professor Khalidi. It's very good to have you with us, Rashid. Your book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonial Conquest and Resistance, is a tour de force. It draws on your personal archive and many monographs, most notably Palestinian Identity, the construction of modern national consciousness, which won Mesa's Albert Hourani Book Award in 1997, as well as Under Siege, PLO decision-making in the 1982 war in Lebanon. The 100 Years' War in Palestine, which can be purchased at our friendly campus bookstore, a different book list on Bathurst and Bloor, combines erudition and what I like to call observatory participation in history, stretching back into your teenage years at the UN. The Egyptian novelist Ahdaf Swaif called the 100 Years' War in Palestine, quote, comprehensive scholarship with the delicacy and intensity of a novel, end of quote. And she's right. Your book is one of the 2 textbooks in my undergraduate course here at U of T on modern Palestine. And almost the entire class is in this audience today. Welcome, History 370. The other textbook, by the way, is our old friend's Ilan book, 10 Myths about Israel by Ilan Pape. In the aftermath of the most recent and egregious settler colonial attempt to expel Palestinians from Jerusalem this past May, Professor Khalidi was asked to brief the UN Security Council on the question of Palestine. In his brief speech, he reminded the 15 assembled ambassadors, quote, in November 1947, the UN General Assembly voted for the creation of 2 states in Palestine. One was eventually established, one was not. For all its many flaws and the injustice to the overwhelming Arab majority of the population that it embodied, that resolution contained one kernel that we can look back on and build on. This is the indisputable principle that there are 2 peoples in Palestine, Israel, end of quote. And there are small and big steps the UN and countries like Canada would take were it not for the Hasbara charges of anti-Semitism that any criticism of Israel invariably elicits from Zionists and their racist allies. Looking ahead to the future, Professor Khalidi asserts at the UN back in May 27th this year that, I quote, it should not be so hard for this body, the UN Security Council, and the world community to accept that the principle that in any projected solution in Palestine, Israel, that all citizens of both the Palestinian and Israeli peoples and both collectivities must enjoy rights and security on a basis of complete equality. Whatever rights one enjoys, the other must enjoy as well. These rights include the right to self-determination and political, civil, human, and religious rights. End of quote. But because, time and again, Israel has gotten away with expulsions, expropriations, and assassinations in the international arena, Palestinians at home and abroad experience discrimination and death. Hearing Palestine is working to make sure that at least on our 3 campuses, Palestinians are no longer silenced or demonized. And in doing so, we take courage from the words and deeds of Professor Rashid Khalidi. Rashid, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jens Hansen. Thank you so much to all of you who played a part in making this this evening possible. I very much appreciate that. And I very much appreciate the chance to speak to you about this book and about some of the issues that the book raises. I'm very glad that this event started with a declaration about the land that the University of Toronto stands on, that Toronto stands on, that New York City, where I'm living and from where I'm speaking, stands on. I live on the island of Manhattan. That's not an Anglo-Saxon name. And you live in a city which has names that are clearly derived from the original peoples, the indigenous peoples. who occupied those lands before colonization by white settlers coming from England in both cases, and Holland and other European countries. And I think that it underlines something that I try to do in this book, which is to take us away from a narrative in which Palestine, Israel, Zionism are seen within a European context, within an entirely Jewish context, within the context of the Holocaust, and within the context of the suffering, in particular during and immediately after World War II, that was inflicted on the Jewish people. That's obviously part of the story, but it is only part of the story. And it is the only part of the story that most people know and understand because it has been assiduously and intelligently disseminated as the only version that most people have available. So in this book, what I'm trying to do is to basically destabilize that entire narrative, bringing up things like the statement at the beginning of this event tried to underline, that we stand on land and we are living in a place which had another people, and in the case of Palestine, has another people. In fact, that's true of Manhattan. That's true of Toronto. They do also have another people. And the question of equality between the indigenous population and between the settler population, as Jens just pointed out in his quote from my briefing to the UN Security Council in May, is at the core of what I argue at the end of the book. I want to talk about a number of things this evening. I want to talk about how I came to write this book. And I'm going to talk about how it differs from several other books that I have written, two of which Jens very kindly referred to, about aspects of Palestinian history. And I think this book is very, very different in a number of ways from those books, even though, as he suggested, it's rooted in them. I want to talk thirdly about why I chose the title that I chose, the 100 Years War on Palestine. Why did I pick that title? What do I mean by that? Why is it 100 Years War on Palestine and not in Palestine? And finally, why do I refer to settler colonialism and resistance? So that's the third thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about why did I use this framing for this book. I'll talk briefly, depending on how much time we have, about the structure of the book, how I chose to structure it. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about a solution that I envisage, even though that's a very minor part of the book. It comes in at the very end. And I think Jens's quote from my talk before the UN Security Council summarizes it. So let me start by talking about how I came to write this book. It's not like I haven't written about Palestine before. I've actually written 3 books solely focusing on aspects of modern Palestinian history. The book about the 1982 Israeli siege of Beirut and PLO's negotiations, the book titled Under Siege, a book called The Iron Cage, which is essentially about Palestinian failure, the failure of the Palestinians to achieve statehood, and the book that Jens also referred to, Palestinian Identity, which is an attempt to understand how people came to have a sense of becoming Palestinians. I wrote this book, The 100 Years War, because 2 people in particular said to me, those books are just not enough. One person was my son, Saeed, who was a playwright and a very persistent fellow. And the other person was a relative of mine, a man by the name of Nawaf Slam. And both of them, each in his own way, persistently over many years said to me, you really have to write something that is not directed at other academics. You have to write something that is not just an academic monograph. You have to write something where the core of the book is not in the footnotes. You have to write something that is written for a general audience. And they were relentless in badgering me and in giving me what I hope were good suggestions for how to proceed with this proposal of theirs, which was each of them separately. They weren't doing this in coordination. I would see my son all the time, and he would tell me these things, and I would see my cousin, who at the time served in New York as an ambassador for Lebanon, and he would tell me the same things again and again and again. And finally, I couldn't take it. I gave in, and I took their advice, and I tried to craft a book that was fundamentally different from anything I'd ever written, and certainly different from anything that I'd written about Palestine. So that's how I came to write the book, essentially because I just couldn't put up with their persistent demands, their badgering of me, to finally do something that was directed at a general reader and that was directed at an audience quite different to any audience I had ever addressed. So it differs from my other books in a number of respects. And the first thing is something that was very difficult for me to do, which was to make this a book in which I spoke in the first person, to make this a book in which I drew on my own personal experiences, to make this a book which was, because of those characteristics, relatable to a general audience. And this was something harder than anything I had ever done before. I have been training to be a historian, not quite since the antediluvian period, but for a very, very long time. Since the 1960s, early 1970s, I've been writing in a certain way, trained to write in a certain way. I wrote my dissertation in the early 1970s. By that stage, I had learned that craft of writing in the third person, writing impartially, and so on and so forth. And I had kept that up even through books that were published by trade publishers. They still read like academic monographs. The Iron Cage, a book published by Beacon Books in Boston, is an example. It is essentially a historical monograph. I tried to write it in a more approachable manner, but it is written in the third person as a history by a historian. So I had to unlearn all of this and write in an entirely different way, write in the first person, which was extraordinarily hard. I had a little bit of help from my son, who as a playwright understands how to write with different voices. I had a lot of help from my wonderful editor, a woman to whom I owe a great deal, Riva Hocherman, at Metropolitan Books. But essentially, I had to sort of teach myself to write in an entirely different fashion. So that's the first thing that I did, and that's the first way in which this book differs completely from anything I had ever written, including things like op-eds and more informal stuff that I had written. The second respect in which this book differs from anything I'd ever written was the extent to which I drew on personal and family history. I didn't just write in the first person. I talked about things that I knew that my family had experienced, or members of my family had written or had said to me, or things that I myself had seen. I begin a chapter by talking about what I saw going to the United Nations in June 1967 during the June War. I begin another chapter talking about my experiences on the first day of the Israeli attack on Lebanon in June 1982. So again and again, what I did was to bring in either my uncle's experiences, my aunt's memories, my father's stories, and things that I myself had seen or experienced or witnessed. And this was completely different. I mean, I had drawn on family history. Palestinian Identity, for example, draws on family history, but it draws on archives. It draws on 19th century and early 20th century letters in an entirely historical fashion, using them to buttress an argument in the footnotes. There's a bit of family history in that book, but I don't weave that through narrative, and I don't do it in the same way that I do in this book. And my voice is not there. I am not talking as me in Palestinian Identity. I am talking as me in the 100 Years' War. I talk about what I saw, and I talk about what I was told, and I talk about what other people told me, especially my aunts, but also other members of the family. And so that's a second respect in which it's completely different from anything I've ever done before. The final aspect of this is I was consciously trying to write for people who don't know a great deal about Palestine. I was consciously trying to write for people who don't need to read the footnotes and won't read the footnotes. I was trying to write a narrative that was self-contained, that was self-explanatory, and that was meant to be directed at people who, you know, don't have the background that my PhD students have, or that graduate students have, or that Jens Hansen's class on Palestine has. I wasn't writing it, in other words, for university students interested in the Middle East, or for specialists, or for journalists or diplomats or NGO workers who know a great deal about the Middle East or about Palestine. I was reading it, really trying to write it for people who don't know much at all. And I've been very gratified by some of the responses I've gotten by people who say, I really didn't know anything about this. And I'm so glad that I read this book. I hope it works in that respect, because that's what I was trying to do. So that's how this book differs from other books. It's rigorously documented. There are 50 or almost 50 pages, I think, of footnotes. If you want to know why I'm saying what I say, there's a basis for it. You can follow up and investigate those sources should you wish to do so, but you don't have to. You can read this just as a narrative, as a story, or as a series of stories. And that's what I was trying to do with this book. Okay, why did I choose the title and the framing device of 100 Years War on Palestine? There are two reasons for that. As I was writing it, I was hoping it would be done in 2017. In fact, it came out a couple of years after that, because these things take much longer than one thinks. And I realized that 2017 was the 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which is a crucial event in the history of Palestine. And so my idea was, well, here's 100 years. And I was attracted to the idea of 100 years war on Palestine, because in the classical framing of what is going on between Palestinians and Israelis, at best, this is described as a struggle between two equals. This is a war. So Israel is making war on Hamas. The fact that Israel kills 2,000 people and a couple of dozen Israelis are killed, and this is not a war, this is a massacre. Rather like some of the events in American history in the West, in which Native Americans are slaughtered, and it's called a battle. And there are a few cavalrymen who were killed. This has been a very lopsided affair in Palestine. The casualties have been very heavily on one side, and one side has lost continuously. This has not been a war between equals. This is not Germany and France. I'll go into other ways in which this is not Germany and France. This is not simply a struggle between two national movements or two peoples. It has an aspect of that. There are elements of it in which it's similar to other national conflicts, but it is a conflict in which one side is making war on another side. And it's not just the Zionist movement in Israel. It has always been the Zionist movement plus the most powerful state on earth at the time against the Palestinians. The Zionist movement was not in the lists. It was not a joust between Arabs and Jews. This was the British Army, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, the intelligence services, and the expertise that had developed over centuries of British colonialism together with the Zionist movement against the Palestinians. It's not Israel against the Palestinians today. It's Israel plus billions of dollars from the United States, plus the most advanced American weapons systems available, plus a pipeline, a torrent of American tax-free dollars, plus American diplomatic support that protects Israel from any sanctions or punishment and provides it with immunity against the Palestinians. So I am saying this is not a struggle between two equal peoples. This is a war on Palestine, waged by not just the Zionist movement, but by Britain, waged not just by the state of Israel, but by a variety of actors, most importantly, the United States. So this is the reason why I framed it in terms of 100 Years War on Palestine. It was coincidental that at the time I was working on this, I was reading about the 100 Years War in France between the Crown of England and the Crown of France, which was not, by the way, a war between the French people and the English people. The Crown of England was held by a family which spoke French at home in a country in which the legislature was the legislative acts of whose parliament were in French until 1429. So a Norman aristocracy was fighting a Parisian aristocracy over who would control France. It was not a national struggle, incidentally. But the point is, it was a 100 Years' War, and it went on for actually much more than 100 years, 117 years as it happened. So I happened to be reading a great deal about the 100 Years' War when I lit upon this idea of seeing the period between 1917 and 2017 as in some ways similar. It was a catchy title. I hope it worked. So that's why I chose the title. As far as the subtitle is concerned, which involves the terms settler colonialism and resistance, I thought I would lay my cards on the table with the subtitle. Okay, someone who comes to this book with the illusion that this is a tragic struggle between two peoples which involves right versus right, or somebody who comes to this conflict even worse with the idea that this is a conflict in which the poor, beleaguered remnants of European Jewry are beset by hordes of Arabs and are only through heroism and will able to hold back these Arab hordes. Anyone who starts with that understanding of this struggle is meant to be set back on their heels by a subtitle which says this is settler colonialism, and what is going on the side of the Palestinians is resistance. And I think this is very, very important to frame things this way. This is a conflict which involves national movements. Zionism is, among many other things, a national movement. It has created a nation state. It is, in fact, quite similar to a number of other nation states in the modern world. It is, however, also the result of a settler colonial movement, a movement which saw itself as a settler colonial movement. One of the ironies of this is that if you say this today, you're assumed to be slandering Zionism if you talk about it as a settler colonial project. In fact, the early Zionists had absolutely no qualms about describing themselves in those terms. There are myriad organizations in the early history of Zionism which proudly describe themselves as colonial. Major agencies of financing and land purchase are called the Jewish Colonization Agency, this or that colonization group. And you have major Israeli and earlier Zionist leaders who talked unabashedly about colonization. This was true of Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the political current that has dominated Israel ever since the 1970s. This was true of the founder of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. Both of them, in their private writings and in their public writings, said, yes, we are colonizing. We have rights in this land. We are biblically tied to this land. It belongs to us. But we are Europeans coming as part of the wave of European colonization to a backwards part of the world. We have superior rights, not just because the Jewish people has rights here, but because we as superior Europeans have the right to do this to a people that is inferior. And this is explicitly present in the writings of many Zionist leaders. So this is both a struggle between one national movement embodied by Zionism and another national movement, which becomes the Palestinian national movement. But it is also a struggle between a settler colonial project, backed as all settler colonial projects are by a powerful European metropolitan power, and an indigenous people fighting to retain control of their land, which the project aims to usurp in its entirety for its exclusive use. Settlers did not come to North America to share the countries that you in Canada and we in the United States live in with the native population. They came to take it away, North America in its entirety, from the native population. Zionism did not come to Palestine to create an Arab-Jewish utopia. It came to Palestine, in the words of the famous monograph by Theodor Herzl, to create a Jewish state, a state in which Jews would have political power, exclusive political power. They would have, in Herzl's own writings, control over immigration, which is obviously meant to create a Jewish majority, which would then run the place. So you had a people fighting for control of their own homeland, an indigenous population, against a European colonial settler project, which of course had its own national ambitions and aims, and which had claims on Palestine, biblical claims on Palestine, but which in certain respects was very similar to other colonial settler projects. I'm working on a new project now in which I'm trying to talk about the dissimilarities between Zionism and other settler colonial projects. And of course, there are enormous dissimilarities. One of them is that most colonial settler projects begin from a metropole with a population drawn from the metropole and want to continue to be connected to that metropole. So you have Scots-Irish settlers in Ireland who are trying to keep Ireland part of what later becomes the United Kingdom and are trying to displace the indigenous Irish population. You have European settlers coming to North America, whether Canada or the United States, with the objective of keeping a connection with the mother country. Now, in the case of the 13 colonies, they ultimately changed that objective. And that occasionally happens with settler colonies. But by and large, settler colonies are extensions of the metropole that want to stay connected to the metropole. In fact, the Pieds Noirs, the French settlers in Algeria, fought a civil war with the French state to maintain the connection between French Algeria, Algérie Française, and the French metropole. And that's the normal pattern. Zionism is completely different from that. The settlers were not coming from Great Britain. The settlers were coming from all over Eastern Europe. And they were people who, for a variety of reasons, had decided that the only solution to what people in those days called the Jewish problem was to emigrate and to go to Palestine and to create a Jewish state. That was the only way to achieve safety. And they were therefore, they had their own national objective. They had their own headquarters, their own organization, their own funding. They were not an extension of the metropole. They were allied with Great Britain through the Balfour Declaration. But unlike settlers in every other 19th or 20th century settler colonial project, they were not a direct extension of the population or of the political will of the metropole. So in many other ways, Zionism is very different. I should say, I describe this as settler colonialism for both of those reasons. And because, that is what it is. That is what it has been, and that is what it still is. You can go to the West Bank and you can see the only example, I think, in the 21st century of a still ongoing settler colonial project. Tony Judd once said that Zionism is sort of out of time. It's missed the bus. The great historian and political thinker, Tony Judd, who passed away a few years ago here in New York. And he was right. If a project like this had been mooted in the 18th century or the very early 19th century, it would have been perfectly in line with other settler colonial projects where European powers exported their population and took over, whether it was South Africa, whether it was Kenya, whether it was Algeria, whether it was Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, took over and either extirpated, eliminated, or dispossessed and cantonized in reservations, in Bantustans, the indigenous population. That might have worked 200 years ago. The irony is that Zionism as a political project starts in 1897, at the tail end of European colonialism. And so it's sort of out of time. It misses its moment, as it were. And at least that's what Judd was arguing. And I think in that sense, he's right. I could talk about other aspects of how Zionism is similar to and is different from other settler colonial projects. But let me go on and talk a little bit about the structure of the book and how I tried to organize it. I organized it, if you ever do have a chance to see the book, I organized it through 6 chapters, which I denominated in terms of declarations of war. So I see this process that I'm describing here, this 100 Years of War, as a war on Palestine, and as a war which is importantly, in most cases, being declared not by the Zionist movement, but by its great power patrons. So I call the Balfour Declaration the first declaration of war on Palestine. So Arthur Lord Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, in November 1917, issues a declaration in which he basically says there's one people in Palestine, the Jewish people, which has a right of national self-determination. And then there are a bunch of other people there who are not a people. They're other non-Jewish communities, is the language of the Balfour Declaration. And they have the right to civil rights, and they have B, religious rights. Jews are a people, they have national rights, they're adjudicated political rights. And all of this is then worked out in the mandate for Palestine that the League of Nations gives to Britain. It's worked out in great detail. You have elected assemblies for the Jews, nothing similar for the Arabs. You have diplomatic, sort of diplomatic status, which develops in the form of the Jewish agency, the right to go to the League of Nations, the right to come to the Foreign Office and complain. You don't have anything similar for the Arabs. And you have an understanding that here you have basically terra nullius, a land with no people except for the Jewish people. Now, the irony of this, of course, is firstly, Britain had no right to grant Palestine to anyone else. It was in the process of conquering it, but it was an Ottoman territory at the time with a population which, secondly, constituted about 95% of the whole, an Arab population which constituted about 95% of the whole. So what Lord Balfour was saying was essentially the 5% of the population, plus other people will help to arrive here, are going to take this country over. And Great Britain will see to it that this happens. And this was then instantiated in the mandate for Palestine. I call this a declaration of war on the Palestinian people. Britain is saying, you do not exist. We're going to impose this people on you. And unspoken in saying this is whatever is necessary to carry out this imposition. We, the government of Great Britain, the greatest power of its age, about to be the victor or one of the victors of World War I, will see to it that this is rammed down your throat. In fact, the actual war and the actual resistance to this effort breaks out at various stages. And the British suppress that resistance in 1920, in 1921, in 1929, and most notably in the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39. And I go into some detail in that first chapter, which is called The First Declaration of War, 1917, 1939, in talking about what Britain did to break the back of the Palestinian people. 10% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine is killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled by the British during their repression of that great revolt. 10% of the adult male population. This is a ferocious repression. And this is, the declaration is 1917. The war is actually carried out in its most important element during the revolt of 36-39. I then, in each of the other chapters, talk about a second and a third and a fourth declaration of war. The second one is the Partition Resolution of November 1947. Here you have not just Britain, and in fact, not Britain. Here you have the United States and the Soviet Union deciding that a country which still has a 2/3 Arab majority, population balance has shifted. It's gone from a 95% Arab majority to a 65% Arab majority, but still a hefty majority, will get less than half of what they see as their own country, and that the Jewish minority will get more than 50% of Palestine. So this is an essentially unjust effort to violate the right of national self-determination of the Palestinians in favor of the Zionist project and in favor of the establishment of a Jewish state, which a year later becomes the state of Israel, a little less than a year later becomes the state of Israel. I call the Partition Resolution a second declaration of war. And in that case, the war is one that is waged essentially by the nascent state of Israel before it proclaims itself in May 15th, 1948, and later on by the state of Israel after the proclamation of independence of the state. But with the absolutely essential military, political, diplomatic, and financial support of both the United States and the Soviet Union. This is crucial. It's not just heroic Israelis overwhelming the Palestinians and then later on defeating the Arab armies. It's Israel backed by the two great superpowers of the post-World War II era. Money, planes, in some cases Americans helping American combat veterans helping Israel in this war. Without that diplomatic support, without that financial support, without Czech weapons, without American weapons, Israel could not have won that war. Certainly not in the convincing and absolutely decisive fashion in which it won it. So this was not just when I say the declaration of war was the UN Partition Resolution of November 29th, 1947. And the war was carried out later on by the Army of the State of Israel and by the militias that preceded the creation of that army. I'm also pointing to the fact, a continuity, that without great power support, without that, without the Balfour Declaration in 1917, without the League of Nations mandate in 1921, and without the United Nations resolution, none of these things would have happened. So these are not just wars by the Zionist movement or wars by the new state of Israel. These are wars in which the greatest powers of the age, Britain in 1917 through 21, and right up to World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union after it. I talk about other declarations of war. I'll just talk about two more of them briefly before I wrap up. We have more than an hour, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm gonna talk about one or two more chapters, and then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about solutions. What I call the third declaration of war is linked to the 1967 war, but it's not actually the launching of the war. What I would describe is that what I describe in this chapter as the third declaration of war is in fact UN Security Council Resolution 242, which is adopted again in November of 1967. November is a bad month for the Palestinians. Balfour Declaration is November. Partition Resolution is November. 242 is November. 1917, 1947, 1967. Those years ending with 7 are bad years for the Palestinians. And this is a resolution which does very much what the Balfour Declaration did and was intended to do, which is eliminate the Palestinians. 242 purports to be the resolution adopted by the UN Security Council, and therefore representing all of the great powers. All 5 of the permanent members of the Security Council vote for it. And the most powerful executive branch of the United Nations, which is to say the Security Council, as a resolution to the entire conflict in the Middle East. It does not mention the Palestinians once. So the issues which are raised by the Balfour Declaration, which are raised by the creation of the Zionist movement in 1897 at the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland, that are raised by the Balfour Declaration, by the Mandate for Palestine, that are raised by the Partition Resolution, the creation of a Jewish state and the non-creation of an Arab state, strangled in its cradle at its birth by this unholy concatenation of Israel, Jordan, and the British. These things, when a settlement is proposed by the UN Security Council in November of 1967, are resolved without any reference to the core issues. The conflict is treated as if it is one between the state of Israel and a number of Arab states, which is the shape that it had come to take between 1948 and 1967. But those were not the core issues. The core issues had to do with Palestine, the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, their existence as a people, and the fact that they had been turned into refugees by being expelled in the process of ethnic cleansing that took place before, during, and after the 1948 war. These things are not referred to except in passing by a phrase which invoked a just resolution of the refugee problem. Okay? So not Palestinian refugees, no details on what that so-called just solution entailed. The Palestine problem, in other words, is swept under the rug. The Palestinians are elided, as they were in the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration does not use the word Palestinian. Balfour Declaration does not use the word Arab. It talks about His Majesty's government looking with favor on the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, with it being understood that non-Jewish communities should have such and such rights. So the Palestinians are elided in Balfour. They are elided again in 242, in Security Council Resolution 242. So I talk about this as a declaration of war. And it comes after the Israeli army has conquered and occupied the remaining parts of Palestine that had remained unoccupied after the 1948 war, specifically the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank. The fourth declaration of war, and the last one I'm going to talk about, is the one around the 1982 war. And here I'm talking both about the war and I'm talking about who declared this war. And this is seen as in Israeli history, and it's seen in the way in which many people look at it, as a war waged by the state of Israel, by the Begin government, by, in particular, Minister of War, Ariel Sharon, on the PLO in Lebanon. Well, it was a war waged by the Begin government. It was a war devised and led by Ariel Sharon, the Minister of War. I refuse to call him the Minister of Defense. There's no defense going on. There's only aggression and war going on. And all of that is true. But what I talk about in this chapter is something that one of my former students first came upon, which is the degree of collusion and complicity between the United States and Israel in the launching of this war. And this is a pattern. You had the same thing in 1967. The head of the Israeli intelligence service comes to Washington in 1967, meets with the Secretary of Defense, I'll call him the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, meets with the President, Lyndon Johnson, and basically tells them what Israel is going to do, and they get a green light from Washington. Similarly, in 1982, Sharon comes to Washington. He meets with the American Secretary of State, General Alexander Haig, and he gets what Haig's chief of staff writes in his notes is a green light for the invasion. So this is not an Israeli invasion. This is not an Israeli war in 67. This is an Israeli-American joint operation against the PLO, against Syria, and to reshape Lebanon. And I think it's really important when I put it in those terms. The declaration of war is not just an Israeli declaration. The war is not just an Israeli war, whether in 67 or whether in 1982. These are shared operations, collective, joint operations, in which there is collusion and complicity between the United States and Israel. Israel not only fights the 82 war with American weaponry, is not only protected by the United States against pressure in the Security Council, Israel has been given a blank check, a green light by the United States in May, the month preceding the attack on Lebanon in June 1982. So that's the structure of the book. There's a fifth declaration of war. I talk about the so-called peace process that ended up with the Oslo Accords in 1993. And there's what I describe as a sixth declaration of war, in which I talk about essentially the Israeli war on Gaza of the last, in fact, 20 years, even though I stopped the narrative in 2014. Let me conclude. I've gone on for over 40 minutes. Let me conclude by talking about how you resolve this. Well, I don't know how it's going to be resolved. I don't actually have a plan. If I did, I would market it. I could, garner some, perhaps some attention by so doing. I don't have a plan. I know, however, a couple of things that I think derived from my understanding of the history, which I sincerely believe have to be the bases of a resolution of this struggle over Palestine. The first is that we have to call a spade a spade. We have to recognize the actual reality of what's going on. If this continues to be framed solely in terms of a specific interpretation of Jewish history, and that's the only way we understand it, it will never be resolved. Because this is not just about the Holocaust. It's partly about the Holocaust. It's not just about thousands of years of persecution of Jews in Europe. It's partly about that. It's partly about a resolution of what was termed for many years the Jewish question. But that's not all of what it's about. And that is the way in which it is framed. This is the miraculous rebound of the Jewish people from the horrors of the Holocaust, in which they reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland, and in which the promises in the Bible are finally kept. Well, if you see it in terms of the Bible, if you see it in terms of that framing, A, you're missing half of it at least, and B, you're not going to ever resolve it. Because the only solution is for people to say, yep, Bible trumps everything. Yep, Jewish suffering trumps everything. End of discussion. Everybody else, bow their heads, go home, leave, give up. That's not going to happen. Indigenous peoples don't give up. First Nations haven't given up in Canada. They're still fighting, and they're still getting, in some cases, their rights. Indigenous population of the United States of America, the Native American population, they have not stopped fighting. The Maoris in New Zealand have not stopped fighting. And that's the case wherever there is settler colonialism. Unless they're completely eliminated, settler colonial projects will always face resistance. That, by the way, is the reason that I use the term resistance in my title. Every settler colonial project, in fact, every colonial project, has invariably pictured the inevitable, necessary, natural resistance to that colonial project as terrorism or banditry or thuggery, or in some other derogatory terms. The savagery of the Native Americans is described in almost every account of the Plains Wars against them. Well, this is resistance. It's the natural, necessary, inevitable response of every indigenous people to being dispossessed by a colonial project. By a settler colonial project. And I think that those kinds of framings have to be accepted as part of our understanding of what has happened in order to move on and resolve this. You cannot start from a unique, obsessive, self-referential understanding of the conflict in terms of Jewish history, in terms of Zionism, in terms of Israel. You have to understand it in terms of what is being done in Palestine by this project, what is intended, what actually happens. And those processes are understandable only in terms of settler colonialism. There's really no other way to understand them. They're understandable in terms of what Britain was doing all over the globe at the turn of the 20th century. In the first decades of the 20th century, and had been doing for a very, very long time in North America since the 17th and 16th century. And so that's the first thing. We have to recognize the history. We have to understand the history. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody has to go around in sackcloth and ashes. It just means you have to recognize, as at the beginning of our event, you recognize that you're standing on land that belonged to indigenous people. Very simple, very, very simple. Pita and hummus and falafel is not Israeli. It's Palestinian. These ruins are not ancient. They are man-made, created by Israeli bulldozers in a specific year for a specific purpose after the expulsion of their population. Those realities have to be recognized. Now, what flows from them, what political solutions have to be based on those understandings is an entirely different matter. I would argue, as I've argued in various places, that this has to be done on a basis of absolute justice, or at least justice and absolute equality. Maybe you can't have absolute justice, but you have to have justice as a principle involved here. What is done to one people can't be justified in terms of the suffering inflicted by others on another people. You can't use Nazism, the Holocaust, the horrific history of Christian European persecution of Jews to justify what is then done to the Palestinians. It doesn't work that way. That is not a morally acceptable calculus. And that has to be eliminated from the equation. And you have to talk about what was done in this country, for whatever reasons, to this people in furtherance of this project. That has to be understood. And that involves an element of a moral calculus, which is based on justice. Secondly, you have to talk in terms of equality. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If you can bring in your relatives from Williamsburg and from Mississauga and from Ottawa and from Chicago, I can bring in my relatives from Amman and whatever. If you have a right of self-determination, your people has a right of self-determination, my people has a right of self-determination. If you have certain rights in regard to religious sites, I have rights with regard to religious sites. Now, sometimes these are hard to adjudicate. the issue of self-determination is not an easy one, how you balance those things. But those are the principles that have to be accepted. It has to be understood that you have two peoples. It has to be understood that whatever rights are arrogated to one group have to be enjoyed by the other group. And that individual rights, civil rights meaning property rights, have to be understood in those terms. There has been a whole process of legalization of the theft of the land, private property, waqf, which is to say pious endowments, and public property by the state of Israel over the decades since 1948. All of it has been legalized and whitewashed. But what it essentially amounts to is taking property which belonged to one group of people in one set of individuals and giving it to the Israeli state to allocate as it saw fit. And that all of those things have to be recognized and have to somehow be accounted for in a solution. I don't think we are near enough a solution, that there's much that can be said about what kind of solution that can be. People may have questions about this that I'd be happy, if they wish, to answer later on. But I'm here mainly only talking about principles insofar as a solution is concerned. I really don't think that you can end this 100 years war. It's now well over 100 years without using justice as the basis and a set of moral principles as a basis for a resolution. Expediency and the right of the stronger, the right of conquest are not a basis for this. And finally, you have to have equality. You can't have what you have since 2018, when the Israeli Knesset passed what was called the Jewish nation state law, a proclamation that only one people has the right of self-determination in this land. That's what the Knesset said. That's a law that has constitutional force. That can't be allowed to stand. There are two peoples here. Now, let me address one last issue that is sometimes brought up by advocates of Palestinian rights. They say, when you say this, equality, you seem to be undermining your argument about settler colonialism, and you seem to be putting the settler on the same footing as the indigenous population. And I think that's actually an important critique. But I think that it's really also important to recognize that in settler colonial situations, eventually, states are established and peoples are created by the settler population. I mean, there is an American people. How it relates to its native indigenous predecessors is a crucial question for the future of the United States. How Canada relates to its First Nations is a crucial question for the future of Canada. But there is a Canada. There is a Canadian people. Settler colonial projects that are as successful as Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, create new entities. And however illegitimate you may argue the settler colonial process is, it produces nations, national movements, national entities, and states in the modern world. And that is a reality that cannot be denied. Now, you can argue you should change the nature of the United States. I would argue you certainly have to change the nature of Israel, at least change the political structures all over the land of Palestine, that the existing structure is completely inappropriate in terms of justice and in terms of equality. But to say there is no such thing as an Israeli people and that they don't have rights, some kind of collective rights, in my view, it makes you blind to the realities that are created by settler colonialism. I mean, there is in Northern Ireland a population whose roots are as settlers, established by the Crown of England at the expense of the Irish people in order to maintain British political control, first English and then British political control over Ireland. But those are people who have certain collective rights that have to be accepted and understood if there's ever to be a resolution in Ireland. And the same thing is true in the United States, the same thing is true in Canada, the same thing in Australia and New Zealand, and the same thing is true in Palestine. There is a second people there that has established itself over more than 100 years now, and it has collective rights. Now, how you balance those with the collective rights of an indigenous population, which is about as numerous inside Palestine, in spite of repeated bouts of ethnic cleansing, as the Jewish population, is a thorny question, which I don't propose to try and resolve tonight. But those are, in my view, facts. Like them, don't like them. You can't say they're just settlers. They don't have a collective existence. You can't say that. There's no such thing as American citizens. The United States of America doesn't exist. Sorry, yes, they were settlers. We were settlers. Those people who came here who were not Native Americans are settlers or descended from settlers. But it's really important to recognize that eventually a collective has been formed. Let me stop here. I've gone on for well over 45 minutes, almost an hour, and see if you guys have any questions. I see we have over 100 people in the audience.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalidi. This was nothing short of informative. I'm sure that everybody has many questions, but we would like to start with some structured questions that a few of us got together. We discussed your book and have thought of. So I believe that Mariana would like to start with a question about the structure of the book, just going back to one of the points you discussed. So Mariana, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
I have a quick question. Mariana, you were a student of mine, weren't you?
I was, yeah.
Yeah, bingo.
Many years ago. Good to see you. Yes, thanks, Lena, and hi, Professor Khalidi. All right, so this is a question, that emerged from a reading group that we had on Monday that was between some undergrad students, some grad students, and Professors Alejandro Paz and Jens Hansen. So the major structuring narrative of the book is about 6 declarations of war rather than a narrative of Palestinian revolutions. And also I have to say that it's very convenient that also you stopped at the 4th declaration of war, because my question is about the 5th one. So how does the first Intifada fit into this framework, given that you describe it as breaking the mold of the declarations of war?
That's a good question. One of the hard things in writing about Palestinian history is to explain the many defeats and to also highlight the fact that in a few cases you had victories. And one of the things I argue in this book is that the first Intifada, the uprising, the popular uprising that broke out in December of 1987, and which went on for several years thereafter, was actually represented quite a significant victory for the Palestinians. And the irony of it is, and I begin that chapter with the Intifada. That's a chapter which goes from 1987 to 1995. That's what I call the 5th declaration of war. The irony of that is that that victory was turned to ashes by the failures of the PLO leadership to capitalize on it, and by the agreements that they entered into at Oslo, which I describe as the 5th declaration of war on the Palestinians. The Intifada was an enormous victory because it showed to the Israeli security establishment, to the Israeli people, and to international public opinion that Israel could not sustain the kind of occupation it had maintained between 1967 and 1987. That the Palestinians would not put up with that. And it led Israeli security managers, most notably Yitzhak Rabin, who later on was prime minister and at that time was defense minister, to understand that important concessions had to be made to the Palestinians. Now, the problem is Rabin never went as far as believing that Israel should give up security control of any part of Palestine. He never went so far as believing that the Palestinians were equal to the Israelis or should be equal or should have full sovereignty. And so there were always flaws in his vision. But he accepted, after trying to crush it by force, that the Intifada had proved that Israel could not maintain its occupation in its then present form. And this, to my way of thinking, was an enormous victory. It was an enormous victory also because the Intifada, the first Intifada, was not just directed at convincing the Israelis that they couldn't hang on. It was directed at convincing the world, and it consciously addressed the world that this was an untenable situation, that the Palestinians would not tolerate it, And I think there was a broad understanding of things about Palestine as a result of the First Intifada in many, many, many parts of world public opinion that people hadn't realized before. So it's in that sense that that's how I put this in the context of what I describe as a declaration of war on the Palestinian people, which is to say what happens in Oslo in 1993 and thereafter.
Thank you.
Okay. We do have a question about your new project. So I will share the screen because there is a little bit of context and I don't want to lose anyone in my reading. So on the differences between Israel and the other settler colonies that you may be studying in your new project, colonialism by Britain in India began with the extractive East India Company, and similar to Canada, we started as well with the Hudson Bay's Company. And so is this a point of difference with the settler colonial paradigm of Israel, or is there still a corporate extractive feature for the Israeli model?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing to do is to draw out a distinction that's first made, I think, by a British historian by the name of David Fieldhouse, which is between colonialism, which very frequently, in fact, generally is extractive. And that's rule over a foreign population with the objective of benefiting, maybe strategically, but mainly also materially from that colony. And that's how colonization of North America begins. It's how the colonization of many parts of the world begins. And in most areas, that's how it continues. So whether we're talking about British colonialism in India, or whether we're talking about other forms of colonialism, which are primarily extractive, they are intended, first of all, to take wealth. I mean, the Spaniards just stole silver, enslaved people, and put them to work in silver mines. Britain stole wealth from India. They took the wealth of the princely states. They seized it. Clive personally stole things as part of his administration of the East India Company. And then they also extracted wealth from those countries by putting people to work, whether through slavery, as in the case of the Caribbean, or parts of Central and South America, or whether through, for example, the cultivation of opium in India, which was then forced on China. This is extractive. This is extractive. This is standard colonialism. So what Fieldhouse talks about, and other historians talk about, is the difference between this and what they call settler colonialism. So India is an example of classical model of colonialism. You're there to obtain benefit for the mother country, but you're doing it with a thin veneer of administrators and soldiers ruling over a native population. Nigeria would be another example. France and Indochina would be another example. That has to be distinguished from what these historians call, and we all now call, settler colonialism, where your intention is not to exploit the population or simply to extract wealth from the country, but to extirpate, to eliminate, at the very least to dispossess the population and to replace it with a white European settler population, okay? In some cases, the only case in which this happens in Europe is Ireland, where Britain is trying to do this using Scots-Irish settlers at the expense of the predominantly Catholic population of Ireland. But that is a settler colony. The idea there is to benefit the mother country through the implantation, and they're often called at the beginning plantations, of a settler population. After you push the Irish off the land, you take their land and you settle excess population from the home country. France does this in Algeria. Britain does this in Kenya. The Dutch and later the British do it in South Africa. We know about Australasia. We know about North America. These, in the end, are not just extractive processes. These, in the end, are also replacement processes. We replace the Aboriginal. We replace the Maori with white European settlers. And we take over their country, even if some of them stay alive and are still there. And so in the case of Palestine, I think what was at stake was not the wealth of the country. It's not a particularly wealthy country. And it's not putting the natives to work. In fact, the Zionist project very quickly decided to exclude the natives and create an exclusive Jewish only labor market with a set of wages much higher than the wages paid to Arabs, and Arabs are kept out. It was called the conquest of labor. But as part of the creation of a separate Jewish society on top of and ultimately in place of the existing Arab society. This is fundamentally different. Same thing is happening in Algeria. Same kind of thing is happening. Zionism is different to French colonialism, settler colonialism in Algeria, but in many respects. But it is similar in this respect. You're not trying just to benefit from the wealth of the country. You are also trying to settle your own population and fundamentally change the nature of the country through that process.
Thank you. It sounds like a very intriguing project. I'm sure many of us are very excited to read it. I think I'll pass it over again to Mariana, who has a follow-up question that very much complements this one. So go ahead, Mariana.
Thanks, Lena. So this is a question that comes from one of the participants, Alia Janudi. So it's, why do we see superpower countries like the US and the USSR, and perhaps the UK as well, support Israel and Zionism over Palestinians? What is it about Israel that makes so many powerful entities, especially corporations such as Volvo and Motorola, want to support it so badly, especially when it comes to military and surveillance efforts?
Yeah. Okay, that's a complicated question. It's a good question. Unfortunately, each superpower or each power has a different answer. That's to say, for Britain, there were one set of motivations for supporting Zionism over the Palestinians. Those motivations change, by the way. At different periods, the British come to have different motivations for what they do. Similarly, the United States does what it does in 1947 for completely different motives than the Soviet Union in supporting partition of Palestine and the creation of Israel. So there's no blanket answer to this question. Let me give you a couple of answers. For Britain, for example, one of the things you have to understand is that long before Balfour issues the Balfour Declaration in November 1917, the British had decided they must take over Palestine for strategic reasons. Support of Zionism is a means to that end. Now, there are many other reasons for support of Zionism. One of them is the attractiveness of the biblical narrative, in particular to Protestants. Their reading of the Bible, especially a certain 19th century reading of the Bible, gives them the sense that the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland is a bound duty for Christians. And from the time of Lord Shaftesbury in the mid-19th century, right up through several members of the cabinet that adopts the Balfour Declaration, that biblical narrative is a really important part of why they're doing it. And there's another aspect to it of why some European powers support Zionism. Very bluntly put, it's anti-Semitism. It's to say we don't want homeless, desperate Jewish refugees coming to us. Let's send them over there. And you know, the best illustration of this is the career of Balfour himself. Balfour had been Prime Minister of Britain under a conservative government in 1905, when Britain passed one of the most anti-Semitic laws in British history. It was called the Alien Exclusion Act. Balfour was the Prime Minister. It was Balfour's government. And this said, at a time when Jews were being persecuted by pogroms in the Russian Empire, they were excluded from Britain. It was an overtly anti-Semitic act. And it was a function of deep anti-Semitism in British society. We don't want them coming here. And so, I mean, the same people who issued this act are part of the government in 1917, which issues the Balfour Declaration. And you can go country by country through the countries that support Zionism. And at the same time as you have what I would call philo Judaism or philo-Semitism, that is to say, certain sympathy for the Jews, or the biblical impetus. On the other hand, in some cases, you also have anti-Semitism. Better to send them there. In the United States, why were refugees from Hitler's Europe not accepted? Anti-Semitism. The United States is supporting the creation of a Jewish state at the same time that American Congress people refuse to allow the Roosevelt or the Truman administration to change American immigration law so that those poor, miserable survivors, well, first of all, people being driven out of Nazi Germany before the Holocaust, and later on survivors of the Holocaust, are allowed to come to the United States. They were not allowed. American immigration laws were not changed one iota because of anti-Semitism. So there are multiple motivations here. And I could go, down to the present, country by country, company by company, if you want. There's no time for that. So there are multiple explanations. And one of the other explanations is the Zionist project has to be understood as a settler colonial project. It has to be understood as a military project, a successful military project. It has to be understood as a project which involved self-financing of the highest level. Amounts of capital are raised by the Zionist movement. The British didn't fund the Zionist project during the British Mandate. They were self-funded. So it's a financial project at the same time, raising money in Jewish communities for the reestablishment, as they see it, the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. And finally, it has to be seen as a public relations project, probably one of the most brilliant public relations projects in history. Long before Ben-Gurion becomes Prime Minister of Israel, during World War I, after he's expelled from the Ottoman Empire, the first Prime Minister of Israel, the second President of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, come to New York, and they work for years building up the Zionist movement, building up its propaganda capabilities, building up its ability to raise money in the United States and to appeal to American public opinion. 100+ years ago, they are laying the foundations for the narrative, which is so dominant in places like the United States. So there are multiple reasons why, corporations and so on. Finally, Israel is a high-tech country, is extraordinarily successful in terms of high tech, and that's why you're going to have Motorola and Raytheon and so on eager to partner with Israeli companies or with the Israeli defense industry, which the United States supports to the tune of $4+ billion a year.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was a really insightful answer to a very complex question. I'm going to pass it back over to Lena.
Okay, so our next question will address a little bit of something you brushed over on the issue of, I guess, unwavering support by the way the Zionist movement was framed in discourse. And so the question here from Emily Albert that Yasmin will post momentarily is that the entire book, I think, and our discussion today operates on the presumption that our readers understand and accept the Palestinians to be the indigenous people of Palestine. So at the risk of centering Zionist readers or listeners here, I wonder if you could speak more explicitly to Zionist claims of indigeneity in Palestine and how these problematic claims obscure the problem, and the other part of the question is perhaps how we could counter them or address them.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a much more complex question than it may seem, because the claim of indigeneity, which is a brilliant attempt to capitalize on, at least in the United States, the growing awareness of the rights of indigenous peoples in the United States, actually sort of mixes apples and oranges. There is a connection between the Jewish religion and the land of Israel. There's no question. There is connection between, and the Bible is not, certainly in its earlier parts, historically valuable as a source, but it is certainly valuable in terms of people's consciousness. It explains to us how people see themselves. And there's no question that people who are today Jews, whether they have genetic DNA ancestry that goes back to people who lived in Palestine in the time of, the Second Temple, say, around the turn of the millennium. Irrespective of that, people see themselves as having that link. Does that make them indigenous? Well, if you accept that claim, then Arabs are indigenous to Spain, having lived there for 800 years. Again, if you believe the Bible, the populations that later on become the populations of Judea and Israel are interlopers themselves who hung around for a few hundred years and ultimately are expelled. In fact, that none of that may be historically true, and most of them probably weren't expelled. Many of them stayed, were converted, and became whatever they went on to become, if the historians are right. But people's consciousness is one thing, and the reality, the hard reality, is another thing. It's very, very hard to show a connection in terms of a people, and understanding also people who are Jews as a people going back 2,000 years. It's a peculiar nationalist conceit that if we think this, then we are this. Well, you know, in French Third Republic textbooks, every little child in France on the same morning of the same week of the same academic year would read Nos ancêtres les Gaulois. Well, the Gauls were not the ancestors of the French, but that's what the French believed. And for, you know, decades and decades and decades, every little French school child was brainwashed with that. That was the nationalist mantra, that Vercingetorix and, I don't know, various leaders of the Gauls are the ancestors of the French. There's a connection between that history before the Roman era and France. There's a connection between the history of the people who later on become Jews in Palestine and modern Judaism. But it's not, I would argue, a connection that has anything to do with indigeneity, especially since you have another population which has been there for millennia, and which certainly has a legitimate claim as being indigenous. This is not, it has to be understood, however, that because of the Bible and the enormous power of the Bible, we're arguing not so much with truth or reality as with belief. And people who have those beliefs, it's very hard to shake them. I think, you know, arguing, well, yeah, in that case, the Muslims own Spain, they're the indigenous population of Spain, is a you know, a counter argument. I mean, seriously, since 1492 until today, doesn't count. All that counts is from the 8th century to the 15th century. All that counts is a couple of years, 100 years of biblical history. All the rest doesn't count. You can't do that. And that's what they try to do.
Yeah.
How much time do we have left?
30 minutes, if I'm
Okay,
correct.
great.
Yes. And we only have a couple more questions from the audience.
No, that's fine. I'm not asking because I'm worn out. I've only taught 2 classes today.
Okay, we have you here until 7. You cannot. So just a really, really brief follow-up, and then Mariana will take over again. Do you think that it would be productive, at least for me as a student who might have to engage in these kinds of discussions with fellow students? We're not historians or, you know, experts of political science or anything like that. You know, as someone who wants the discussions to be as productive as possible, do you believe it's there's merit in setting aside the question of indigeneity altogether and just focusing on the fact that, indigenous or not, there's still a very problematic process by which Palestinians are now being displaced and are an imminent threat for decades. Mm-hmm. And an argument of indigeneity cannot really protect or justify that. Is that a reductionist?
Yeah. I mean, I see why you might say that, or might feel that that's tactically necessary. But I think that the continuity of the existence of the people who call themselves Palestinian today in Palestine and their rootedness is an important part. I mean, this is not some transient population that's being moved. It's a constant argument of settler colonial regimes. Well, the Arabs never really, were settled in Palestine or in Algeria or wherever it may be. The Bantus arrived on the Cape about the same time as the settlers. And I think that the rights of an indigenous population have to somehow come into the equation. Now, you're absolutely right. What is being done in terms of displacement and dispossession and ethnic cleansing and theft of property and discrimination probably should be the focus. But I would not completely abandon the sort of bedrock part of it, that this is, I mean, their villages have been there for hundreds of years. You know, there are families that go back to the time of the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. The two families that hold the keys to the Holy Sepulchre have probably been there since the 7th century. And to say that these are not the people of the land is monstrous. To say, well, there's a claim that goes back to, you know, King David and King Solomon, which antedates, precedes, and trumps. I mean, this is monstrous. You can't say that the city of Jerusalem doesn't belong to, in some sense, the Nasabi family. I mean, for heaven's sakes, they hold the keys to the Holy Sepulchre since the 6th, 7th century, because the Christian sects can't agree. So they give the keys to two Muslim families. So I don't, you know, when I talk about this, I don't focus on this. It is, I think, an important part of the argument.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana.
Thanks, Lena. So I guess following up on that, there's another question from our reading group that we had earlier. So given that the sort of 100-year frame of the book goes up until 2017, so how did the events of the recent uprising from May this year, how does that figure into the book's framework? And would your framework change if you were writing it now? Do the new forms of global solidarity, like Save Sheikh Jarrah, change the conditions of international recognition for Palestinians that were put into place under the Balfour Declaration and the mandate?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think some parts of what we've been seeing since April of this year, in particular, this unity uprising in the occupied territories inside Israel, among Palestinians and among many Palestinians in diaspora as well, in Jordan and Lebanon in particular, fits into the resistance part of the framing of this book. This is not an intifada on the level of the first intifada. It has nothing to do with the second intifada, which is a completely different beast. But it does fit into a narrative of settler colonialism producing resistance. And, you know, in each case, Sheikh Jarrah is a case of you know, a microcosmic case of settler colonialism. People are claiming that they have rights to property and to expel people from their homes, which Palestinians don't enjoy. So the discriminatory nature, all of those aspects of settler colonialism are in Sheikh Jarrah in microcosm. And the element that I talk about in the 6th declaration of war, which is to say the way in which Gaza is treated, also comes in. Because again, you have this of fire on Gaza. You have rockets out of Gaza, which kill a small number of Israelis. And you have hundreds of 250 or so Palestinians killed. And so you have this, as you had in 2014, as you had in 2012, as you had in 2008, 2009. You have this captive population with nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, no shelters, subject to the firepower of one of the most powerful militaries in modern history. And firing back. I mean, firing rockets and causing damage and doing it in an indiscriminate fashion and killing people in many cases. But the lopsided death tolls are evidence that this is not a war of equals. This is a war of a superpower against a people with relatively limited means of hitting back. So those parts of it fit in. I think what's new are both the global solidarity that was touched on in the question and the degree of unity across the fragmented geography of Palestine and Palestinians. One of the things that the Israeli occupation has done, one of the things that has happened since 1948 has been the fragmentation, physical and geographical, of Palestine and of the Palestinians. Some lived under Israeli rule, some lived under Jordanian rule, some lived under Egyptian military administration, some lived as refugees in the host countries, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And each was under a different sovereignty, under a different administration, and so on. And this has been perpetuated even since Israel took over the entirety of Palestine in 1967. Palestinians inside Israel enjoy rights that Palestinians elsewhere under Israeli control do not enjoy. Palestinians in Jerusalem have some rights, but not all the rights enjoyed by Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinians in the occupied territories enjoy almost no rights. And so you have 3 different regimes, 4 different regimes, because Gaza is treated differently than the West Bank, even within Palestine, even within an area which is completely under Israeli control, from the river to the sea, from the Egyptian border to the Lebanese and Syrian borders, it's all under Israeli control. But you have 4 different regimes of control. What happened in May of this year, involving a wave of protest that spread across all 4 of these areas, as well as into Jordan and Lebanon, and among others, Palestinians in the diaspora, was unprecedented since the 1930s. Or maybe it could be argued maybe the 1960s, when the Palestinian resistance first emerged and took over the PLO. Certainly, it's unprecedented in recent decades, and that's different. And I think the global environment is different. It's not just a matter of global solidarity, though. That's really, really important. It's the beginning of a receptiveness to an entirely new narrative, which simply was not there, certainly not to the same extent before this whatever you call it, uprising, outbreak, outburst, whatever. And that's true in particular outside the mainstream commercial media. It's much less true for the conventional mainstream media, but it's particularly true on social media. And it's particularly true on non-mainstream media. And it's particularly true among young people. And it's particularly true on university campuses, where you had a receptivity to a new narrative, which is unprecedented. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize, the importance of my book. It's not important in the larger scheme of things, but I think this book sort of caught a wave and is selling in a way that nothing I've ever written has ever sold, and just printing after printing after printing, and getting exposure. I never got asked to speak to book clubs almost 2 years after the book went to press. And I have like 5 book clubs I'm supposed to speak to. This doesn't happen usually. This has nothing to do with my virtue or the virtue of the book, if any it has. It has to do with this change. And it's not just my book, it's stuff on Palestine. Noor Ariqat's book is getting the same kind of attention, Justice for Some. And there are other individuals, other efforts that are receiving attention that would never. Mohammed Munal-Kut are being treated in a way no Palestinian spokesperson was ever treated in the past. Not Hanan Ashawi, not you name it. And she got wonderful exposure. She did a wonderful job in her day. But what's happening here is different and new. And so it's not just global solidarity, though that's really important. And of course, in the United States and in Canada, I can see that what's happened in terms of Indigenous peoples, standing rock in this country, and similar things that are happening in Canada. What happened especially after the murder of George Floyd, and before that, the Black Lives Matter movement, sensitized people to forms of discrimination that made them more open to thinking about maybe Palestine fits into some kind of larger framework. But so we're in a different time. That's not true of everybody. I mean, you have. I'm not talking about Canada now. I'm talking about the United States. You have a racist, white supremacist counter-offensive, which is ferocious and which has captured one of the political parties, one of the 2 major political parties in the United States. So it's not this is a done deal and all is for the best and the best of all possible worlds, and everybody's young, progressive and young. There are a lot of old, nasty white racists out there. And they're very powerful. But there is a new openness to the Palestinian narrative that I don't see as ever having been here to that extent. And I was born in the United States. I went to school in the United States. I graduated from college, university in the United States. And then I left the United States for many, many, many years, but I came back in the mid 80s. And in all of those years living in this country, I have never seen anything like this ever in my life. So yeah, there's something is different here. How I would fit that into a revision of the book, if I ever revise it, I don't know. That's another question. Let's leave that to another discussion.
Maybe that'll be the next book after your current project. I'm going to pass it off to Lena to sort of wrap up the audience questions.
Yes. Okay. So there are quite a bit of questions, but we've decided to limit the last set of questions to just 2 of them, both on the note of opening up the avenues for perhaps a different vision for the future of Palestine, particularly in the West and discourse in the West. So the first question is by Isaac Wright here, asking if you could speak at all about the history of restricting pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist speech in the West, and what do you think the proper role, the critical role, in my opinion, for those who are neither Israeli or Jewish or Palestinian or perhaps even Muslim or Arab in this context is? What role do they play as objective actors? And the second question, and you can gauge how much time you need for either.
Those are 2 questions already, but go ahead. That's fine.
It's a very professor-student moment here. So what role do they play in the first one? And the second question would be from Quinn. She's asking if you're able to elaborate on the parallels between Northern Ireland and whether it's a path to an imperfect or fragile peace through the Good Friday Agreement, if that is of relevance to examining colonialism in Palestine. So both questions are posted up on the screen here in case you need to revise, but you can go ahead.
No, those are great. Those are great questions. I'll answer each of them in turn. One of the great successes of the Zionist movement, as I said, was to establish their narrative as the only narrative. I've said it's a public relations project, even as it's a financial and a military and a national project. And that starts with the Bible, and it goes on. As a result, as the questioner, as is clear in the quotation from the book up here, the colonial nature of this encounter hasn't been visible to most Americans. And I quote Edward Saeed as saying, Zionism triumphed because it won the political battle for Palestine in the international world in which ideas, representation, rhetoric, and images were at issue. You have that up on the screen before you. It's entirely true. And part of this has to do with occupying all the bandwidth. This is the only reality, okay? Israel, the national nature of Israel, the revival of Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land, the biblical connection, the connection to the Holocaust. That's all that can be said. Anything else cannot be said. And in fact, if you push too hard, we'll call you an anti-Semite. So the restriction of pro-Palestinian speech has taken multiple forms and has multiple dimensions and has operated over decades and generations. In its most virulent and poisonous form, it takes the shape of accusations of anti-Semitism for anybody who dares to champion Palestinian rights. And occasionally it fastens on to the occasional case in which it appears that there is anti-Semitic content or where there actually is anti-Semitic content. But essentially what this is intended to do is to smear anybody who dares to disrupt the existing narrative, which has been established and dominant, and in fact, as I said, occupied the entire bandwidth. Nobody said anything different for decades and decades and decades in the Anglosphere, in the United States and England. There were dissident voices, but they were at the very margins, if they existed at all. And this effort has gone on steroids in recent years because there's an understanding among proponents of Israel that they're losing crucial constituencies. They're losing progressive Democrats. They're losing a large part of the youth in the Jewish community. They're losing college campuses. They're losing academics. They're losing several denominations of the Protestants, and so on and so forth. They cannot get away with the kind of barefaced, naked lies that passed for unadulterated truth. Israel is outnumbered. Israel was always, beleaguered. Israel was always attacked. Poor little Israel. You can't say that about a nuclear superpower that's bombed a half dozen Arab capitals. You can't say that about a country that people see operating as a regional superpower today. So maybe if you grew up in the wake of the Holocaust, maybe if you grew up in the wake of the '67 war, and you had a consciousness shaped by that, i.e. if you're old, you will cling to those old images and those old framings. But for younger people, it's much harder to sustain that. And they recognize the gradual dissolution of the sort of barrier against the Palestinian narrative. And they're frantic about it, in some cases almost hysterical. And huge resources, lawyers, hot and cold running lawyers, Israel advocacy people stationed in every Hillel on every American campus, i.e. Israelis brought in, paid by God knows whom, to work on Israel advocacy as part of the Jewish life centers on campuses. What this has to do with religion and Judaism is beyond me. It's the advocacy for the policies of a specific state, which is seen as, by these people, as part and parcel of their mission as Jewish life centers, which normally are in charge of things like, organizing Jewish people's getting together on Jewish holidays and so on. In the United States, I don't know if you have that in Canada. So that's my answer to the first question. And this has become quite vicious. There's an organization called Palestine Legal, which operates to support academics and students who are targeted by these campaigns. They field hundreds of complaints every year, and are often forced to go to court. So you'll have a Students for Justice in Palestine branch at Fordham University in New York shut down by the administration. They go to court and so on. And this is stock and trade for a lobby, for a body of supporters of Israel who do not want the other voice to be allowed to speak, and will go to any lengths to prevent that. And you guys, anybody who in Canada can see the same kinds of processes. In many cases, the direction is central. You had a Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel, which directed these things. That's now been, that effort has now been incorporated under the new government, the Bennett government, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry. But the state of Israel, through its government organs, and one presumes through its intelligence service, is helping to direct this, which then is locally organized by different organizations supportive of Israel, whether in the United States or Britain or in Canada. And then it goes down to the local level. But you see the same arguments used. You see the same talking points. You see it's centrally directed and centrally organized. The role of non-Arabs and non-Jews. I think that something that I argue in this book is important to this. This is not an issue as between them over there, okay? It's not Jews and Arabs in Palestine. It's not Zionism and Palestinian nationalism. It's not Israel and the Palestinians. It's the United States, Europe, and Canada enabling, supporting, financing occupation, dispossession, and death of Palestinians. Without American support, without Canadian support, without European support, this could not be happening. It would not happen. So it's not a matter when you ask, what is the role of non-Arabs and non-Jews? Your role is to pay taxes which go to supporting the Israeli military, or go, in the case of the United States, to training American police forces in the tactics used by the Israeli border guards, who are a tool of colonial repression of the Palestinians. So they're not being trained in police tactics. They're being trained in colonial military tactics against a subject population. And that's what our role is as citizens and as taxpayers, whether in Europe or the United States and Canada. And so, if you ask what should we be doing, we should be doing something to prevent our governments from supporting injustice, very simply put. This is not an issue for Jews and Arabs alone. It is an issue. If one is Jewish or one is Arab, one has a responsibility to take a moral stand and to be a political actor, perhaps. But what I'm arguing here is that this is something that, because of the role of Britain from the beginning, because of the role of great powers from the beginning, and because of the continuing role, in particular of the United States in Europe, and Canada is there, of course, this is something that you guys are involved in. We are involved in as citizens. You as Canadians, if you're Canadians, or Americans in our case, or Europeans, if you're European. Israel's connection to the EU, the way in which Israel benefits from trade, not just Israeli products produced in settlements in occupied territories. The support that Europe gives to Israel, the support that all of the Western countries give to Israel, is absolutely essential to the continued occupation, the continued colonization, the continued dispossession. So, it's up to you as a citizen. Just like as an American, it's up to us to speak out about American wars in the Middle East, not because we are necessarily Middle Easterners, but because our country is doing this in our name with our taxes, harming the populations of the countries being occupied and attacked, and bringing home thousands of people damaged by their participation in these wars, damaged emotionally, damaged psychically, in some cases physically damaged. So that's one's job as a citizen. It has nothing to do with one's ethnicity, being Jewish or being Arab, religion, being Jewish or being Arab. Last question, elaborate on the parallels to Northern Ireland. I don't know how much any of you know about my new project. I don't know where you learned what you learned. The project is not about Northern Ireland per se. It's a project which right now operates under the working title of Ireland and Palestine, Britain's first and last settler colonies. And what I want to do is to learn from what I can come to understand of Irish history and of the history of British colonization of Ireland, about settler colonialism in general and about Palestine in particular. And obviously, one has to recognize that there are huge differences between what Britain did in Ireland and what was done in Palestine. Ireland starts really with the Norman conquest, and then it goes on steroids at the end of the 15th century, where you actually have settler colonialism. You have plantations of English and Scots settlers, and the Irish are pushed out of basically the northeastern part of the country, what is today Northern Ireland, and some other areas of Ireland. And you have settler colonialism with the same kinds of objectives that settler colonialism has in other places. It's different, but it shares some characteristics, and it's the template for much of what Britain does elsewhere as a colonial power and in terms of settler colonialism. In fact, at the height of this, under Henry VIII, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and later on under the Commonwealth, and later on in the 18th century, what is being done in Ireland is being done simultaneously with what is being done in North America, whether in the United States, the 13 colonies, or in Canada, after 1763, when Britain takes over Quebec. And there are enormously important parallels and differences between these settler colonial projects. And Britain learns from them. The templates, the molds, the attitudes that Britain develops and that are later deployed throughout the British Empire start in Ireland. Everything starts with Ireland and then continues through North America and India into the rest of the empire. So it's lessons that start in Ireland or start in North America and then are learned in a different way in an entirely different setting in India and in other parts of Asia and Africa, which then are deployed in the Middle East, and in particular in Palestine. And there are specifics. When Ireland wins its independence as a result of its War of Independence in 1921, the British are forced to disband one of the key tools of repression that had been used to keep the Irish down over a very long period of time, the Royal Irish Constabulary. 700 of them are sent to Palestine and form the core of the Palestine Gendarmerie. So British colonial lessons are not just lessons that Balfour learned as chief secretary in the castle in Dublin. or his brother learned when he was chief secretary in the castle in Dublin, i.e. the top British official governing colonial Ireland. Or there are lessons that are learned at the level of the sergeants and the lieutenants and the privates in the Royal Irish Constabulary, which they then use with their truncheons on the heads of Palestinians or with their guns in Palestine. So I want to explore all of these things, and I want to explore not just the similarities, but the differences. There's a flattening, and much writing about settler colonialism, there's a flattening of the differences between these cases. Each of one has specificities that make them entirely different from every other case. South Africa is completely different from Palestine. Yes, there are two cases of settler colonialism. Ireland is completely different from Palestine. Yes, they're both cases of settler colonialism. And what I want to draw out are the similarities, but also the differences. And I want to complicate the picture, and at the same time learn something about Palestine and perhaps also Ireland. And then to answer the real question, which is about parallels to Northern Ireland, to what extent does Ireland show us the possibilities for in the future resolving the relationship between a population that starts as a settler colonial population, but has now, in the case of Ireland, been there for centuries? I mean, Northern Ireland Irish Protestants are not newcomers. You can argue the Irish are indigenous, that is, say, Irish Catholic majority is indigenous, and these people are settlers. But if they've been there since King James or since Queen Elizabeth, they are not newcomers. They're 12th, 15th, whatever, 16th generation Irish. And somehow a means has to be found for resolving that politically. God knows it's one of the most complicated problems on earth. It's been going for 600-800 years. But I think there are lessons there, of things to do and things not to do. Just as there are lessons from South Africa, good lessons and bad lessons, and good and bad lessons from places like Kenya or Zimbabwe, which were also settler colonies, or from Algeria, which was also a settler colony, or from the North America examples.
Yeah, thank you. Let me thank you, Rashid, on behalf of all of us here at Hearing Palestine. You've held us spellbound for a good 2 hours. I think it's time you have a rest and we digest all your comparative perspectives on settler colonialism, which fits so well into my course. I look forward to discussing your lecture with my students and with everybody else who worked so hard to get this off the ground, especially our colleagues at York University, our supporters at U of T, and elsewhere. You gave us a really nuanced but also uncompromising account, and you're putting what we're trying to do here in Toronto at Hearing Palestine into global and historical context. So I look forward to hosting you in Berlin when the German translation comes out next year, and we'll see how much pushback we get in the land of Palestinian blasphemy, as I call it. It's not just a Palestinian exception, it's actually blasphemy to speak about Palestine in Germany. I think you fall on very many ears, supportive ears in Canada, since we're used to the settler colonial paradigm, and we accept that we ourselves, many of us are settlers ourselves. It's a bit of a different story in Germany. So I look forward to that. And with that, I just want to ask our staffers, students, to give a sort of a forward look to a couple of future events, or those events that we have lined up for this term, and bid you farewell, Rashid. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Jens, and thanks to all of you, Mariana and the rest of you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I hope you tell people about the book. I think it may help make a difference. And it's educational institutions that are the best venue for this. High schools are contacting me now, and I encourage that. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we will wrap up the evening. We're just a minute over, but there are 2 events coming up. one on October 14th on the legal oppression in Palestine. We're going to be talking about Israeli courts, military courts, and the role of international law. We have two wonderful guest speakers, R.D. Emsis and Randa Senora. So please visit our website, which will feature a registration link very soon. And Mariana, you want to speak very briefly about the October 21st event?
Sure. So the event on October 21st at noon is Spatial Encounters, Aerial Imagery Mapping in Palestine's Colonial Landscape by Nadia Abusada, who's a PhD candidate, I believe, in architecture at Cambridge University. So I think that'll be really interesting, very different, looking at this from a very different vantage point than what we discussed today.
And
So
an
yeah, I
alumnus
think
from
that link will
U
also
of
be
T,
available soon.
Mariana. He was also at U of T as an undergraduate.
Oh, wow. Any final thoughts, Alejandro?
No, just to thank our wonderful audience, and thank you, Mariana and Lena, for doing such a great job of facilitating. And thanks once again to Professor Rashid Khalidi for his engaging talk. We have a lot to think about. Bye, everyone. Oh, and thanks once again to the Nathanson Center for hosting at the time of this censure, which has only been temporarily lifted. Let's hope that the university does the right thing and fulfills all the remaining conditions. Bye, everyone.